A man named Walter Johnny D. McMillan was arrested, convicted and sentenced to death for the murder of Rhonda Morrison. Johnny was actually innocent. He's punished for a crime he didn't commit. He then had to be held in prison until the day of his execution. On the other hand, a law student at Harvard University named Brian Stevenson is studying to be a special attorney for death row defendants. Brian is an intern at a Georgia prison. One of the prisoners asked Brian why he went to Harvard when there were so many white people there. He then said his reason for becoming a lawyer was because he wanted to help other people. But he doesn't yet know the best way to do it because that year racism was still high in America. Not only for criminals, even for an educated person like Brian.
Come back.
Long story short, after Brian graduated, Brian intended to move to Alabama. But his family, including his mother, did not agree if Brian went there. Because racism for black people is very severe. Moreover, many people died there just because of self-defense. Brian then reassures his mother that he wants to fight for the people who need help the most.
You better be careful.
Long story short, he then arrived in Alabama. He immediately met his colleague named Eva Ansley. They plan to open legal services to death row convicts with the grant money that has been given to them. Obstacles then came to them. When the person who was supposed to be renting out their office space suddenly refuses to rent it out. Because they are lawyers for death row inmates and because Brian is black. Because of that, Brian is temporarily staying at Eva's house and plans to run their business. The following day, Brian went to a prison to meet a client on death row. In this prison there are cruel wardens. Brian was even told to take off all his clothes for a search before he entered the room, whereas the rules for lawyers do not need to be searched during legal visits. But they did it because Brian was black. Brian was deeply humiliated.
Been over and spread.
There he met several inmates who were usually in his lawyer's residence. One of them is Herbert Richardson, a former doctor in the Vietnam War who was convicted of detonating a bomb that killed one woman but not on purpose. As a former Vietnam War soldier, he has post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, which Brian's job is to try to help them escape the death penalty because whatever they do, their lives still have meaning. Brian then met Johnny D., who was staying with his lawyer because he ran out of money and was sentenced to death. Johnny D. was fed up with promises that had previously been promised to file an appeal until he submitted a reconsideration until the trial to the Supreme Court. But still rejected. According to Johnny D., black people like them will only be suppressed and will be vomited. They don't even hesitate to accuse people without evidence because they don't need it. Even false witnesses they can easily present. Tired of all this, Johnny D. rejects Brian. He thinks Brian will not be able to fight the corrupt people out there. There will be no justice for black people. When he returned to Eva's house, he then tried to recheck the files of people he had visited while in prison so that he couldn't sleep. Brian told Eva that he was sure that Johnny D. was innocent because his accusation was based on the testimony of one witness named Ralph Bernard Myers, who was a criminal who at that time was also being indicted on a different murder case. Plus someone named Bill saw Johnny D.'s truck on the side of the road where the murders took place. Eva and Brian believe that because the police couldn't solve this case for a year, Johnny D. was finally chosen as a suspect based on the testimony of a criminal who might give false testimony in order to get leniency. Brian then plans to meet the prosecutor named Tom Chapman. Brian said that he had serious doubts about being certain about the veracity of Johnny D.'s case. He later expressed his doubts in Johnny D.'s file, but Tom was rejected because Johnny D. had already been found guilty by the jury and it was his job to maintain the integrity of the jury. But Brian countered that it was his duty to seek justice for his client. On hearing this, Tom gave a very thin file of witness and prosecutor statements. If he wanted the rest, Brian had to file a motion in court, said Tom. On his way back from there, Brian tried to go to see Johnny D.'s family who lived in a black settlement building a house away from the main road. After going inside, Brian met Johnny D.'s wife named Minnie. Brian was surprised when many neighbors gathered who also wanted to hear Brian's story. One of them said that Johnny D. was innocent. When it happened, they were all grilling fish to raise church funds. They promote the show all over town until they work from morning till night, and Johnny D. is there cleaning the truck with his son named John and also his friend Jimmy. Plus many of them went with Johnny D. that day. They accused Johnny D. not without reason. According to one of the neighbors far from this incident, Johnny D. was arrested because in the quotes he played with white women. Her angry husband then tried to make sure everyone knew about it. The story begins to develop. Johnny D. is referred to as a con man, developing into a dealer to becoming a member of the mafia and as a murderer. They say it's just another way to kill black people. Brian said that he would help without Johnny D.'s family paying for it. After the meeting, John introduced Brian to his friend Darnell. According to Darnell, he has something to prove Johnny D.'s innocence. According to Darnell, Bill, the man who saw Johnny D.'s truck near the scene of the homicide, fabricated his testimony. Because Darnell worked with Bill from 8 in the morning until noon. According to Darnell, Bill was arrested for theft, and when he gave his statement he could be released without charge. Brian then persuaded Darnell to sign an affidavit so that it could be used to reopen the case. Darnell was scared at first, but eventually he agreed to help. The next day Brian returned to see Johnny D because of Brian's efforts to meet his family and neighbors. Johnny D began to believe in Brian. Brian gave Johnny D news on the progress of Brian's efforts to reopen the trial. Because Brian already knew Johnny D's family, Johnny D then asked what motivated Brian to become a lawyer, that he wanted to do this for free. Brian later recounted that when he was a child, his grandfather was killed and there was no one to help. So Brian thought no one cared about blacks until black deaths were taken for granted. Hearing this, Johnny D agreed Brian to be his attorney. In the prison room, Johnny D gets word from Herbert that his execution date has been set. Johnny D told Herbert not to give up because they already had Brian. It's really unfortunate fate, Herbert. He went to Vietnam to defend his country but was thrown into prison like trash. Even though PTSD was caused by the war he went through, he should have been hospitalized and treated, but that year there was no justice for black people. Herbert left for Vietnam at the age of just 18 and was the only survivor after the Vietnamese army invaded his group. Because of that he later had a mental disorder until he attempted suicide. After returning to America, Herbert's PTSD got worse. During the trial, none of the facts about his assignment to Vietnam or the mental trauma he experienced were revealed. That night, Eva received a call because she was working with Brian. Of course Eva, who heard the threat of bombs under her house, she became frightened. When the police came to check her house, they found nothing. Because of that incident, Brian said he wouldn't blame Eva if she wanted to stop. But Eva refused because she thought she would still do what she thought was right even though she was shunned by her friends or received threats like earlier. Eva then asked what they planned to do for Johnny D. The next day Brian and Eva went door to door to ask the residents about anything they knew about the Rhonda Morrison murders. Of course, many refused after knowing that they were working to defend Johnny D, but Brian got a former police officer who found the body for the first time and he was willing to tell the story. Eva also found a flyer that Johnny D's family made about a fish grilled event for their church's fundraiser, and it could be evidence. While gathering information, one day Brian managed to find a house to serve as his office. Brian named his office the Equal Justice Initiative. There Brian and Eva's business began. Besides focusing on handling the case of Johnny D and his friends, they also began to accept other cases and also new employees. One day Darnell called Brian for help. It turns out that Darnell's affidavit got him arrested because he was accused of giving false testimony even though he was telling the truth. Brian took the time to try to drop the charges because he saw Darnell was terrified and was convinced that they wouldn't be able to fight the man. Darnell then refuses to help and asks Brian to convey his apologies to Johnny D's family. Brian gets annoyed and then he goes in there and goes straight to Tom as well as Sheriff Tate. Brian asked for the charge of false testimony against Darnell to be dropped because it had no basis. Brian asked for it to be repealed so Darnell could testify in court. Tom and Sheriff Tate looked down on Brian. They agreed but were followed by news that Brian's motion to open the trial would be rejected even though Brian had not received any official news. As if because of Brian's impudence they would easily do that. On the way home, Brian was stopped by a police car for no apparent reason. For refusing to get out of the car, Brian was even pointed at a gun, and meanwhile the other policeman dismantled the files in Brian's car. After doing that the police then left. In prison, Johnny D is no longer surprised that many authorities are obliged to do this to Darnell. Brian's motion will certainly continue to be rejected. Brian was shocked to hear that Johnny D had been sentenced to death before the trial. They can do that, let alone just block the motion for retrial. Black people in Alabama seem to be facing the Cold War just to get justice. One day Brian tried to make a bold move. He decides to meet with Ralph Bernard Myers, the only witness who put Johnny D in prison. Brian had a very hard time getting Ralph to speak about his testimony at trial. Ralph only said that while he was being held in Escambia prison, before he testified at trial, Johnny D at Ralph had asked the sheriff about the Morrison patrol 2 months before the trial. After that he then left Brian. The information was immediately conveyed to Eva that there might still be evidence held in the Escambia court. Through a connection from their new employee named Brenda, Brian was finally able to get in there and succeeded in duplicating the recorded evidence and also the interview transcript file. A surprising information obtained by Brian. In the tape Ralph is questioned by Sheriff Tate. He admitted that he had absolutely no idea who the Rhonda Morrison murderer was. Brian is still trying to file a motion with the court to reopen Herbert's case. But the other day they got a reply that the motion was rejected and the execution would go ahead. The day of execution for Herbert arrived. He said goodbye to Johnny D and his other friends. He will be executed in the electric chair. Brian, who came before the execution, apologized to Herbert for failing. Herbert's execution began and from above came a shout of support for Herbert.
You're the only one kid enough to fight for me.
Judge Jerry M. White for the murder of Rena Mae Collins.
For the first time, Brian experienced the most terrible thing in his life. After Herbert's execution, Brian has even more motivation to help Johnny D. When that night he finds something from Ralph's file. He then returns to meet Ralph in prison. Brian reports that he has listened to the tape of his conversation while Ralph is being interrogated, which on the tape Ralph says he doesn't know anything about Johnny D or the Rhonda Morrison murder case. After that, Brian shows Ralph the file that after Holman Prison, Sheriff Tate transferred 2 prisoners to death row. The first is Johnny D and the second is Ralph. Answered. Why did Ralph give false testimony? Because he didn't want to be executed. He ended up lying to escape the death penalty. In exchange he got 30 years in prison. Brian then invites Ralph to testify in court to help Johnny D. Of course Ralph refuses. But Brian was so good at persuading that Ralph was finally willing to do something right. April 16, 1992, the trial to decide whether Johnny D deserved a new trial was conducted. Ralph, as a key witness in the previous trial, was brought into the room. When he was sworn in, Ralph pretended to be sleepy and said that he was woken up at 2 a.m. by the officers to be brought here. Ralph seemed to want to tell Johnny D and Brian that he was getting a threat. Ralph looked worried and afraid to testify. He always said he forgot and he didn't remember because his testimony was 6 years ago. He seemed to be playing it safe by answering everything he didn't know. Brian knows that Ralph is afraid of Sheriff Tate, so he blocks Ralph Tate's view of Sheriff Tate. Brian then played Ralph's psychology. He told Ralph to appoint Johnny D so he could see an innocent person separated from his wife and children for a crime he didn't commit. And Ralph was the one who caused it. After Brian repeats his question, Ralph answers the question emphatically that he didn't see Johnny D at the scene.
Absolutely not. Thank you.
After that, Tom asked and said that Ralph changed his story because he was disappointed with the previous deal and this was done so he could get some relief. Ralph then gave a striking answer. He doesn't care anymore, they will do anything to him, and also insists that whatever he said about Johnny D was all a lie and he can confirm that. Ralph's testimony made the trial continue by presenting some evidence and witnesses. Brian also managed to bring in a former police officer who gave true testimony when he found the body of Rhonda Morrison. When he was told to lie in Johnny D's court 6 years ago, he refused and that's why he was fired. A doctor from a mental hospital who is Ralph's doctor is also present. Ralph once had a mental breakdown when he was about to be executed in the electric chair if he didn't give the statement the sheriff wanted to hear. There was a lot of evidence at that trial that had not been presented at the trial 6 years ago. It was on that basis that Brian asked the judge to agree to reopen the case in a new trial. Brian did a good job. Even a policeman who was once tyrannical to Brian, finally now sided with Brian by letting Johnny D meet his family. 1 month later, the judge made a decision that was arguably unreasonable, as if ignoring the concrete evidence that yesterday he deemed Ralph's testimony irrelevant and that would be rejected by the court since the pressure placed on Ralph after his testimony 6 years ago. So there's no conclusive evidence yet that Ralph perjured himself at the trial 6 years ago, so there won't be a new trial for Johnny D. He will be returned to prison and will be executed in the electric chair. Hearing the judge's decision, which was unfair and without consideration, made John, his son Johnny D, disappointed and angry. He was deemed to have insulted the court and was later detained. An unexpected result. Again, no justice for black people. Johnny D was right. They would continue to block everything they did. They certainly didn't want to admit that they had punished innocent black people. Especially when black lawyers like Brian prove it. Brian, of course, sad because he should have managed to bring Johnny D home. But he just made things worse. Eva then encouraged Brian that he was an important person in this community because with Brian's presence for the first time they could fight and demand justice. Brian then reunited with Johnny D's family and neighbors. Yesterday's trial was disappointing, but they still had one more step. Brian plans to prepare a motion for filing evidence to the Supreme Court. They could overturn the final verdict of the judge and force a new trial. There's no guarantee this will work, but Brian also believes that there's no reason the Supreme Court would ignore their evidence. John said if this worked, his father would still be called a murderer. That's why Brian decided to bring the case to a TV show. Johnny D interviewed by famous hosts. So is Ralph. If the court could be ruled by someone with an interest, then in this way society could judge that even Tom's heart was touched. Johnny D's fate is now in the Alabama Supreme Court decision. Brian hoped they would decide once the files on the case were shown to them. 3 months later, the employees at the Office of Equal Justice Initiative are now increasing. One day Brenda received a call that the Supreme Court's verdict was out. Brian then immediately went there, and as a result the previous judge's decision was overturned and a new trial for Johnny D was approved. This news of course made the community excited. Brian was sure after this Johnny D would be free because he was innocent. Meanwhile, Tom, as the prosecutor, did not want to comment. As expected, the road to justice is indeed steep and rocky. As Brian prepares for a new trial, Tom's application file appears saying they will adjourn the trial so they can open a new investigation. Faced with this, Brian bravely went to Tom's house. He couldn't believe Tom would want to reinvestigate even though he knew Johnny D was innocent even after the Supreme Court approved the evidence. Moreover, all the witnesses from Tom have admitted to being wrong. Actually, Tom had nothing more to prove this. This reinvestigation will find nothing. Brian then asked Tom to join him when he filed a motion to drop the charges. Heard this, Tom told Brian to leave his house. March 2, 1993. Racism is still happening even in court. It had been an hour since Brian's family and supporters were told to wait outside and were not allowed in. Only after the seats inside were full then this officer on orders from the sheriff allowed them to enter. Of course, the participants in the trial seemed to be separated between the blacks who stood at the back and the whites who sat in the chairs. The trial presided over by Judge Pamela begins. This trial began with Brian's statement that he filed for annulment of charges against Johnny D. Brian then spoke, who said that it was easy to see this case as proof that the defendant was innocent. But when he sentenced a black man to death a year before his trial, plus there were no black people on jury, plus it was based on white testimony and ignored the testimony of 24 law-abiding black witnesses, the evidence that Johnny D. was innocent remains implausible. Used. People who try to tell the truth are threatened. This trial is not just a trial for one person. But it can be said to be a test of whether we will be ruled by fear and anger or by the rule of law itself. If those who are standing behind it are immediately said to be guilty when they get accused, if they live in fear because this could happen to them. If the system treats the guilty rich better than the innocent poor, then we are not fair. If justice is equal to protect the rights of every citizen regardless of wealth, race, or status, then the nightmare for Johnny D.'s family should end soon. Brian said that the allegations against Johnny D. proved to be made up, from people who have a vested interest in reputation. They ignore the truth by doing that. It means we have not respected the law. It is not justice and it is not right. When it was Tom's turn to make his statement, Tom surprisingly said that he agreed to join Brian. He agreed Johnny D.'s lawsuit was dropped. Trial is over. Johnny D. can be free and can go home. Brian finally managed to save Johnny D. after 6 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Johnny D. then packed his things. His freedom was greeted by the screams of the other inmates, as well as Ray, who cried seeing this victory. Johnny D. was finally able to return to his home to be with his family and community members. Brian's victory of course brought new hope to the case of false accusations based on racism. On April 2, 1993, state senators invited Brian and Johnny D. to hear about the death penalty. In front of the senators, Brian said that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. That the character of the nation will not be reflected in the way we treat the rich and the privileged, but in how we treat the poor who are disliked and despised. If we look at ourselves more closely and honestly, then we will see what we need. Justice is all we need. Only compassion.